All right, so welcome. This is the Texas Early Learning Council's Early Childhood Data Roadmap Work Group meeting. This is the second time this group is meeting. Is that right? It's the third time. It's the third time this group is meeting. I'm Sarah Abrahams. I serve as the Deputy Chief Officer for Prevention and Early Intervention at the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services and as the chair of this work group. Welcome to our fellow council members and to staff and members of the public that are in attendance. We are producing this meeting as a Zoom webinar, and council members, presenters, and agency staff are participating as panelists, while members of the public are able to participate in listen-only mode. I have been asked to ask folks to keep their electronic devices on mute when not speaking, and that Megan, who is serving as our facilitator, can also mute folks if needed. She is our Interagency Deputy Director of Early Childhood Support. Members and presenters, please remember to state your name each time before you speak. And public members or other folks joining us, the official opportunity to submit written public comment closed at 5 o'clock yesterday, but members of the public are still able to request to provide oral public comment today if you haven't already registered, and you can do that by emailing your request to Megan, and she just dropped the email in the chat. And then I think, is that all of our housekeeping? Okay, fantastic. So then what I'm going to ask is for members to locate the draft of the May minute meetings, which were both in your emails and attached to the calendar invitation. And just want to give folks a second to take one last look at them and to call for any edits or changes in the minutes before we both approve the minutes and sort of use that as our roll call for today. So if there's no last minute changes or other additions, then I request a motion to approve the draft minutes.
So moved.
All right, thank you, David. And then I need a second.
I'll second.
Thanks, Allison. So if there's no discussion, then we can move on to the roll call vote. I'll turn it over to Megan.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So panelists, when I call your name, please reply for, against, or abstain. Sarah Abrahams.
For.
April Crawford.
For.
David Fagan.
For.
Kim Coffrin.
For.
Kirsten Schwab.
For.
Laura Varnell. Allison Wilson.
For.
All right, the motion to approve the May 2022 meeting minutes has carried, and I will turn it back to you, Sarah.
Great. Okay, so the first part of our agenda is around learning more about and hearing more about the Texans Care for Children School Readiness Dashboard. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Fagan, the Senior Policy Associate for Early Childhood at Texans Care for Children, and ask him to provide an update to our group.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and good to see everyone. This will be a pretty brief update, but I think substantive, and we can certainly have a back and forth about it if folks would like. So we have been in the process of sort of confronting all of the things that are required to build a dashboard out of nothing the past several weeks, which has been exciting and a new experience for our team. So there's been sort of three parallel efforts. One has been finalizing the indicators and measures, which will populate the dashboard. And that has taken the form of a lot of conversations with our data and research partner, the P&3 Policy Impact Center out of Vanderbilt, who is doing a lot of great work in compiling the data that will populate our dashboard. And in that process, we've been finalizing the measures that make up the dashboard. And that was something sent as a pre-read. Megan or Chelsea, I don't know if you're able to pull it up on the screen, or I can if I have that power. I think I do.
Yeah, David, I'll make you a co-host right now and then you can flip it up.
Okay, great. And so I'll do that in a second. And I'll also just mention that the other efforts happening right now are, of course, all of the different data visualization, which is taking place and making a lot of progress in terms of the design of the dashboard, the photos of adorable children that will populate the website, the sort of where graphics will be and how the website will be organized. So a lot of those decisions are being made. We will have a beta testable version of that dashboard in the coming months, so look forward to that, which I'll be able to share. And finally, we are in the process of researching the policy levers to move this data forward in a positive direction. So we're really looking at the inventory of state and local, federal policy initiatives that have taken place around the country that we might want to highlight on the dashboard. So with that, I wanted to give an update briefly on the measures of the dashboard so far. And I will try to screen share here if you give me a moment. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time walking through each of these because there's a lot here. But I did want to just kind of give a general sense of what the buckets on our indicators actually equate to. So as a reminder, the indicators of school readiness that our dashboard is identifying are sufficient household resources, good health and development, positive adult-child interactions, and enriching early learning experiences. Each of those has a set of measures that we're highlighting to show how Texas and different communities are doing in helping students be school ready under that category. As you can see, we have a combination of access measures and outcome measures. So, for example, on sufficient household resources, we have access to programs like SNAP, but we also have outcomes like the rate of children who are in near poverty, the rate of households reporting child food insecurity, which tell us different things, right? In talking to our research partners, the child food insecurity, for example, is a measure that will be much lower than the rate of children in near poverty, because child food insecurity is sort of the most extreme demonstration of insufficient household resources. It's often the last thing that sort of falls when a family is really struggling. And so each of these sort of tell us something distinct. So there are, of course, many other measures that we could include, but we tried to be succinct while also trying to be holistic in terms of the different measures we are covering. So on good health and development, you'll see a combination of things. This is the one that has the most measures, perhaps unsurprisingly. It includes things like ECI, but also the rate of children who are accessing Medicaid and CHIP, and the rate of low-income women of reproductive age who are uninsured. So it does include some maternal health measures as well. And each of these sort of has a research-based connection to school readiness, including things like preterm births. And so, we're going to have visuals for each of these measures that will be on the dashboard, so we'll be able to see. It'll be sort of a snapshot of sort of the most recent year of good data, but over time, we suspect that there will be kind of comparisons that folks can do to sort of see how we've progressed since the last iteration. So quickly on positive adult-child interactions, we include things like child maltreatment, but also some of the more positive things like that are included on the PN3 policy roadmap, like the percentage of children read to every day, for example. And early learning experiences is largely about access at the moment, which includes access to quality childcare as well as Head Start. And so that is sort of where we're at with the measures. I know I went through that quickly, but I didn't want to take up too much of our time. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any sort of other feedback or response that you might have.
I think Kirsten put a question in the chat about like how we would be able to drill down, like what is it all state level, or will some of this be available? Some of this data is intended to be available at region or county or zip code level.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kirsten. I have another version of the stock that isn't ready for prime time, but we are looking for each of these measures to see, can it be disaggregated by race and ethnicity? Can it be broken down by zip code or county level? The short answer is not all of them can, many of them can. So we will have some that isn't possible for, and we'll have to highlight that fact. But there's some where, you know, you can get local data, but not race ethnicity. There's some that you can do race ethnicity, but not local. And then there's some that you can get all of them. And so it's a little bit different of a story for each. And you'll also have noticed, you know, while we're talking about that there are some things, especially those that are sort of state data, that we can do more recent. Anything that's sort of reliant on census numbers, you know, we've been told to really go back to 2019 as sort of the most accurate year to reference. So you'll see that where there's 2019 reference, it's largely because it's reliant on census data, and the census has said to not use their data from 2020 and 21.
And
so.
when are we expected to be able to begin using that data with more accuracy?
It's a good question. I'm not actually sure.
Because lots has changed since 2019.
Indeed.
David, can you say a little bit more about why, what's the connection with, like, I can't even find quite the right way to ask the question, but like, you see a lot of indicators here that make you think, you know, poverty, adversity, you know, access to programs that are kind of disconnected from school, from like the school system, yet it's framed as like school readiness. What's the sort of framing around school readiness versus adversity, poverty more broadly?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I skipped ahead a little too quickly, but so, you know, the reason why all these things are under the school readiness bucket was that the initial motivation for this dashboard was that, you know, all of us intuitively understand that for a child to be succeeding in school, there's many things that drive that success that aren't just taking place in the classroom. And so when we put together our work group back in 2020, who was really charged with what are the things that influence how children do when they show up to their first day of school? Like, what are the drivers of that, of a child's readiness, of a child's ability to succeed? And then, you know, from that big list, we then really started researching it and seeing, you know, where is there data that shows these correlations? So this isn't just as a replacement, certainly, for, you know, a kindergarten entry assessment or other sort of tools that we use in progress monitoring in schools, but rather it's to give us sort of a more holistic picture of like, what are children bringing with them when they show up on their first day of kindergarten, and how do those things impact their ability to succeed and their readiness? So that's the intention. And, you know, each of these, like I said, has sort of a distinct story about their connection, but they all sort of share that framing.
It just makes me think a little bit about TexR3, you know, the work that it's sort of you could imagine a system or a desire analytically to kind of bridge the kind of contextual predictors and characteristics you have here with, you know, what's more of a sort of description of like the current state of early childhood programs in terms of quality and distribution around the state and kids entry. It's just kind of interesting to think about what will, I wonder, be a disconnect between like TexR3 data, which I don't know, I think most people on this call know about, and then this. It seems like there should be a bridge at some point where you could analyze TexR3 data with some of these contextual characteristics coming out of your dashboard.
Yeah, and I will say that, you know, as the state's data efforts improve and you know, we have more that's available, you know, from the state, I think the dashboard will evolve with it. I think, you know, our intention is to align, and it's a big part of why we're part of this group and others, is to really make sure that over time, we're using the best data we have today to really be able to tell policymakers and communities, like, if we want to improve school readiness, here's some things we can look at and focus on. But the data is incomplete and insufficient. And so as TextR3 and other efforts sort of build up over time, I think some of what we include here will change and hopefully improve.
I mean, it is, I find this to be extremely helpful, in part because I know there's been a lot of, even for me, some confusion or blurriness maybe between the kinds of data that we are talking about for this roadmap that's coming directly out of state systems or state databases, and this at least initial outlining of indicators and measures that are coming from sort of a different set of sources. And so you can really see how they're complementary in that way. And so it's really helpful to see it outlined like this. And I do think that extra set of information about how deeply any of these indicators can be drilled down, either by county or by zip code, and whether or not they can be disaggregated by any kind of demographic information, yet race and ethnicity for sure, but also home language or age of parents, or various things that are ways that we can provide more targeted outreach or support down the road. I think is just super helpful to know, even to help continue to create alignment between those data points.
Yeah, we've always seen this dashboard as sort of able to provide the state of school readiness in Texas, but also the state of school readiness data in Texas. I think it'll reveal very clearly where there are still gaps and where there aren't. And so that'll be something that we uplift. We won't just leave to interpretation. We'll be very clear, like, this is a gap. This is how we should improve it over time. And
then in terms of sort of overlaying this really with sort of school success data, or maybe that's the wrong term, but to April's point, thinking about sort of more explicitly making the connection between these kinds of indicators that we know sort of aggregately help set kids and families up for success, and then what's actually, sort of connecting that to what we're actually seeing once kids get to school and how they're doing, and both in terms of academics and also in terms of things like attendance and other ways that we can kind of track engagement. And so I wonder, is there a plan, or how are you guys envisioning that will get connected at some point?
Yeah, I think like one of the things with school readiness that's tricky, as everyone here knows, is a single measure is not going to be sufficient in understanding like a child's school readiness, even in an ideal world where like we have assessments reported for all the different domains, and we have this and that and the other. It's like, it is very difficult to draw sweeping conclusions from a single measure, and that does make it hard when our goal is to drive school readiness, and we want to be able to track not just how we're doing on these indicators, but how are we doing on the ultimate goal of a child being ready and then able to thrive. So, we haven't made any predeterminations on that. I do think a good first step would be to know all the different domains of the KEA and have that actually tracked and traced. But, that's not something that we're charging ourselves with on year one of this. I think the first step is, what are the measures that have been shown to move this? How can we move those measures? And then how can we start to tell a story about outcomes that, we feel good about?
Just want to check the chat to see if there are any. Oh,
Can I ask a follow-up question, Sarah?
Sure.
Kirsten. So David, I'm just curious, given that distinction you're making, why is it that you're calling this Texas, school readiness per se? I'm just kind of wondering about your definition to April's point.
Yeah.
I wonder about, you mentioned success, thriving, some other words. I just wonder if there might be a different way to describe this.
So I think there's a lot of reasons. I think one of the main ones is that it's a big goal in Texas right now for children to be school ready and strong readers by 3rd grade. And it is something that the state has really rallied around. And, you know, for a long time that has meant, you know, very specific strategies to get there. But since the state has identified this as a big goal through a million different ways, through House Bill 3, through the Tri-Agency Initiative, through so many different efforts, we felt it was important to be able to show all the different things that actually improve for us to really improve school readiness. And so because it's a goal in Texas, it made sense to us to really focus on how to best achieve that goal that there is support for in our state. And so, you know, that's one of the main reasons. I think that, you know, we could talk about just like happy, healthy early childhood, but, and many of these measures would be useful for that as well. But because of, I think, the emphasis that our state has put on this, that's sort of why we focused mostly on it.
It's interesting, and this is like splitting hairs at some point. So I'm just going to throw it out there, but like the TextR3 group, I think there's a framing around school readiness that I think some people have tried to shift toward more about being systems and schools being ready for kids,
Right.
Versus sort of, there's something, it's striking, like all of the measures you have here, these are all like critical measures and important things. So it's not at all, like, I think what you're measuring is important, like what you're bringing together in this dashboard. I think there's just something interesting around, these are a lot of these factors, they're not at all in the control of schools.
Right.
So it creates a little bit of a feeling of like, well, look at all these kids who just aren't ready for school. And it's not, it's there, I don't know, it just makes me feel like there's a little bit of a, you know, the schools really have to be ready to support these kids, these children, you know, so there's a little bit of something, it feels like there's a little bit of ground lost that TextR3 was maybe going to gain, where the reframing was, yes, we have kids who, you know, are coming with some challenges that they've faced in their childhood, and it can impact learning. But schools, knowing this information about their community and the population they're supporting, schools can be ready, you know, to serve and support the kids. So I don't know, and this is like literally a title. So like in the way you create the dashboard, the website, the images, the kind of text, all that stuff that's around it, framing it might help convey that story. But yeah, that's just my
Really helpful point, April.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's like, it's hard because it's a both and, right? It's like, you know, if the idea is just schools being ready for kids, then it's like, okay, great. The work starts at age 5. And I know that that's not what any of us want either. And so, you know, the point that we've been trying to emphasize is like, we can't just wait for the kid to show up to school for the first time. It's like, this is an effort that needs to begin right away.
Right.
But I totally hear you that, you know, we certainly don't want to take any accountability away from the school, who also has a huge role in being ready for children, regardless of what they're bringing with them. So I'm always happy to talk about the best ways to frame it, and because there's no easy answer, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I really thank you so much for sharing this with us. And it's very exciting, I think, to see these things be developed in parallel and in concert. And so I really appreciate that. And I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to our next agenda item, which is really going and digging a little bit into some of the policy question recommendations that this group is trying to pull together, which is essentially like, why would we need an early childhood integrated data system in Texas? And what are the things that we would hope to learn or know? And so the last time, this is really a continuation on that discussion. And I think the aim of our discussion today, so just to give us a little bit of a goalpost for the next 20 minutes or so, is to try to prioritize 1 or 2 additional policy questions in addition to the foundational question, to focus on specifically for the next step of this work, which is our stakeholder engagement and stakeholder conversation. So it's really given that we have a little bit of a limited scope and that we really want to try to be precise and efficient with the conversations that we have over the coming months and into the fall with stakeholders about how to best frame this kind of dashboard as something usable, as something that communities and stakeholders would benefit from. Our task is to see if we can't prioritize what we need more information about or what we want to ask stakeholders about. So just to frame, that's what we're aiming for. We made a few edits to the questions based on the feedback from our last meeting. So I just want to walk through those. The first change is that we broke out the foundational questions so that that first question that we feel like we have to answer before we can answer anything else. And so we broke it out into 3 questions. So what's the total population? What's the population of families and children that are eligible and with access to early childhood services and programs? And which families and children are not being served? And I think actually that's very aligned, David, with the set of measures that I think everyone agrees that's kind of foundational. Before we ask more in-depth questions, we've got to know how many are we talking about and who are they? And then we did a little combining and shifting. We combined the questions on quality and program improvement to now just be number 2, this sort of one grouping of questions around program quality. We combined the school readiness and child health outcomes so that it's really, I mean, I think, David, what you indicated are the state's children starting at birth healthy and on track to succeed, which includes sort of this idea of school readiness. And then we shifted a bit the question number 6, which was we added this separate question on child and family need. And this is one that I will admit that offline, I've had a couple of conversations one-on-one with folks about it as a place where maybe we want to make a more explicit change. Because I was sort of feeling nervous about this term need and how it was being defined. And so one of the things that I want to suggest is to think about breaking up this question of need into 2 separate questions. One is a question of benefit and one is a question of assessment. So really, I mean, the first, like just in chronological order, the first one would be sort of how are we identifying, or when are we identifying, or in what ways are we identifying families and kiddos that need which services and programs. And then the second part of that is really about benefits. So which early childhood services and programs are benefiting which children. And so I am not married to those or that idea. And if folks feel like this question of need really captures all of that, then I am also fine to stick with our original question. But that was one on, as we were preparing and thinking about this meeting and really how to be more clear, it was one that tripped me up a bit. So I think I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any feedback, both about the ways that we took the feedback from last meeting and if this feels like the right group of questions, and then if there's any additional changes, including to that number 6.
Sarah, building on your need thought question.
Yeah.
And thinking about the early childhood education space, so that childcare subsidy space, I also think, when we know we're not serving all the eligible kids currently, right? So there's a gap in funding there. But then we also know there's families who really can't afford childcare that don't qualify for, that they're above that threshold to be eligible for the services. So that's where like the need is larger than what we define as our current eligibility. And that's not even getting into, a big gap, but just, so that's where my head is at. I don't have an answer there. I was just really kind of
Talking out loud.
Yeah, that would that like, where do we define? Are we just defining need by our current eligibility parameters for all the different programs, or are we doing need really based off of need?
Yeah, I think that's part of what tripped me up about this question, and I thought would be both hard to define and hard to measure. And so, but it may be that's, so I'm open to what you guys think about keeping it as is or potentially shifting more into this kind of assessment screening / benefit way of addressing that. Megan, do you want to pull up? I think we have a sort of complementary slide right after this, right? That it's kind of reordering these questions so that we can just think about it in a slightly different way. Megan, do you want to just help me explain what the difference is between the last one and this one?
Yeah, I'd love to. So this is actually thanks to April. April, you had a framework that you had in your mind, and then you emailed to Chelsea and me and Sarah after the May meeting. And so this was our attempt at taking that framework as you presented and sticking the different questions against it. So I think this is not to say that you have to start at the top and work your way all the way to the bottom, like that they're necessarily in that order of operations, but just a way of thinking about the different buckets that these are in terms of our foundational questions really match against population, program, and participation. And then the other questions align more with quality and outcomes. And April, if you want to talk more about how you think this might help people think through it, definitely go for it.
Okay, it helps me think through it because the idea is if you're always specifying sort of the target of whatever it is you're talking about, whatever program component or issue area, you're clear about the target. The design is what you intend to deliver, like the sort of integrity and access level of your intended program. Receipt is actually who gets the service. Questions related to that. Delivery is where you start to kind of drill down and do more to measure the effectiveness of the actual interventions or programs and services that are being delivered to people. And then response is more about actually understanding to what extent there's uptake or change related to the investments or the programs. So the reason it looks kind of cool arranged this way, they're right, you don't have to do this in any specific sequence. The idea is just that if you attend to these different aspects of the service work or the intervention or program work, that you basically avoid holes in what you're learning and understanding about your programs. So sometimes people have lots of data on how they delivered something and they really realize they don't have critical data on response, or they're missing data on detailed data on who received a service. So it's just kind of a framework to try to map your questions in a way that regardless of which program or initiative you're interested in, there's thorough attention to the data being collected.
I like it.
And I know we lost the screen for a second. Hold on, and I'll get it back up.
Thought you were expecting us to have it memorized already, Megan.
I got the dual monitors, so I got it up. I don't know.
Oh,
I'm trying to brag, but
whatever, David.
So I guess our charge then for right now is to say, do we think do we have enough of a solid start on these questions that we can move forward into our stakeholder engagement, like our stakeholder conversations? Do we feel, I think we need to make a call about that question number 6, and mostly that's y'all saying, just please leave it as is, or yeah, we think we should shift it over to this other thing. So those are 2 questions related to these like, do we have it together? And then the second thing that we need to do is see, and Megan, I don't know if we want to go back to the other one also, we can flip back and forth between them, is to see, are there specific questions in this list where we really feel like we want to better understand, both get stakeholder input into, and we're going to look at some of the stakeholders that we brainstormed from last time, but sort of look to see what kind of feedback do we want to get from them? How do we narrow what we're asking? And are there specific questions where we really want to focus some time with them to better understand how they would use this information, how they would benefit from having this information? What would they do? What actions would they take if they knew this information? Because part of what we're trying to understand is the why behind creating the data and aligning the data this way. So I think that's sort of our charge. We talked a little bit about just saying, well, let's ask the stakeholders about all these questions. Don't we want to know about everything? And we can do that. It's just, we probably won't be able to dig as deeply if we do that, just given the time constraints. And so we can decide that we're going to ask a little bit about all of them, but we really want to just take one or two, even as proxies for how to, to dive more deeply into some of the use case scenarios. And so getting the recommendation of this group about which ones we should choose for that, I think would be helpful. So let's start with the first set of questions. I know I just talked a lot. Let's start with the first set of questions, which is, do we have this right? And do we need to make any changes?
I was with you on number 6, needing to be a little more specific, and then agreeing that, with what Kim was saying, it wasn't exactly clear to me if we need broadly the need, or need with a kind of what programs are available and what are the eligibility criteria for those programs. That question felt actually a little clearer to me in that other figure, because it was right under like the idea that it's linked to your participation in programs and services.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I kind of agree that it might need a little bit of work.
So maybe, would it be fair to say, I mean, I understand what Kim is saying, which is that there really can often be a distinction between families that are eligible and families that, for whatever reason, would be determined as needing, whether it is a professional opinion or the family's opinion or data shows. I think that is a much more complicated thing to define. And so I wonder if the way to narrow this, just for the sake of this set of conversations, is to say something like which families and children are eligible. Because that seems like a much more attainable question to ask, or at least to start with.
Well, and we know we know we don't have our current funding, no matter which department we're in, isn't enough to serve all our current eligible children. So
Right.
As much as I personally and professionally want to argue to include that bigger, we still need to start with who is eligible in our current landscape, and then we can make an argument, down the road to expand that. But I think that's where we are right now.
And so Megan, oh, go ahead.
I would point y'all to the foundational question.
That's what I was just about to say.
Yeah, because we do have this second foundational question is, what is the population of families and children eligible and with access to? So
it may be that we just asterisk this, or sort of save it for like in an appendix of things that we are still asking, but for the purpose of this stage in our discussion, that we can take off number 6, maybe, if it's captured in the foundational information about who is eligible.
Unless 6 is more about the sort of process of matching people to the services they need. So they may have eligibility, but there's something in between being eligible and actually helping navigate and move people into services that they need.
So it's really about understanding the process challenge between our two foundational questions. I think I'm saying this right, April, that it's trying to ask about, if we know the population of families and children eligible, and we know the number that are being served and not being served, why are they?
Mhm.
What is the why? Do we have any information about what's the difference between who's eligible and who is being served? That's
Right.
the number 6 question here, rather than, which I think is based on the foundational questions, but maybe
Right.
one more layer of understanding.
Right. Is it because there's no providers in that, are they in a childcare desert and there's nobody there? Is it because, there's not enough funding for, provider X to serve more children? So like, there could be a couple different answers to that question. So I think that's a good thing to ask.
Okay. So then with that, making that change then here and sort of making that number 6 really more about what is the difference between who is eligible and who is being served, essentially. Does this feel like a solid enough starting place for what we're trying to do, which is with our next step, which is really to take these questions out into communities and with other folks that might use it and say, have we got these questions right? Would you use, how would you use the answers to this question? How would this benefit you? Where do you want to focus? So that's really the next step before we start making recommendations back to the council or even sort of finalize a roadmap. It's to take these questions and vet them with folks that would actually be using them. So if I think I'm getting a nodding consensus. So then I guess the next part, Megan, is do we need to focus in on 1 or 2 of these places? Or are there 1 or 2 places where we think we really need, these are places where we just don't have enough information from stakeholders? Or do they all, I personally was having a hard time parsing them out in that way. And so I'm hoping that you guys can help me think through that a bit.
It's just hard because I feel like it depends on the stakeholder that we're talking about.
That's a good point.
And I don't know if the current engagement plan is very distinct based on which stakeholders we're referring to, but because to me, I think there's a lot of stakeholders, especially when you design it in the sort of target design, receive, delivery, response way, where it seems strange to limit that discussion. But when we're just talking to parents, for example, I think there's certain things on return on investment is probably not useful to get kind of parental feedback on, but there are things like delivery and participation in program that are really important to get parent feedback on, and we wouldn't want to waste time on the other pieces. So I think it's just going to depend on which audience we're talking about.
Megan, let's pull up the other slide just so that, to David's point, so we could look at the other one too.
Yeah, I agree with David. Return on investment, though, I think is one of the more important questions up there because it impacts several of the other questions. If we do more about the impacts our programs are having, we could educate people in a way that could maybe solve some of those funding issues we all keep talking about, so, or at least come close, inch us closer. But that would be a whole different audience than parents, like you said. So
will there be a single stakeholder group with mixed perspectives, roles as stakeholders, or are you going to are these separate?
Well, why don't we go to the next slide and we could talk that through. Maybe we just have to do this in, oh, I didn't talk about this slide. Do you want to talk, should we?
Let's jump ahead to the stakeholder, just exactly where April was about to go. Is that clear?
Yeah, we'll come back to this. Okay, So when we met last time, we started doing a little bit of brainstorming about who we were talking about. And that's really, I think we came up with a pretty comprehensive list. And the truth is we can't talk to everyone. That's not the point. It's really just to get a bit of a representative sample from folks who might benefit or use this kind of information. And so I think it's really up to us to recommend how we think these questions might be best answered. And if we want to, I could envision that we would split these conversations by these groupings that we have them in right now, or we could just open up 6 or 7 and first come, first serve, and just have a conversation with a mix of folks that might be sort of a mixed use group. Or we could, so I think I don't think we've landed on that yet. But I think we are beginning to define who we think are stakeholders here and who might use information like this.
One of the tricky things is, I think the temptation would be just to group it by the headings there. So like the agencies and the program coalitions, but like there might be an argument for more splitting it based on the like system of expertise, right? Like a health conversation, and maybe I'm just thinking about my experience, but folks are going to talk about the data systems they're familiar with. And as I said several times on the dashboard, like those contexts for those data are completely distinct from each other and have specific challenges. And so I think it can be hard to talk about Medicaid and CHIP data in the same conversation as childcare subsidy data, as the same conversation as, home visiting data. And so I don't know the best way to group it, but I would say that being targeted rather than like having several open opportunities would be the way to go, especially when you're talking about with parents who often get kind of shoved to the side when it's a crowded conversation with full-time professional researchers and advocates.
Well, I agree, David. And I think I was going to say to the parent piece, I think having a parent space and one could potentially argue teachers and the ECE service providers own space as well. We want them to be successful, and we want them to have a voice. And so if they're in a crowded room with a bunch of us, they don't feel as comfortable sharing. So I think we need to give them their own space and make sure that we're not only inviting them to the table, but we're really encouraging them to speak.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I agree with that. And I think we really want to take advantage of places where parents or teachers or home visitors are already coming together and have a little, so for example, the councils that are already existing that are for parent voice, and some of the places where home visitors or teachers are already coming together to provide feedback. I think our intent could be to sort of align with those existing opportunities so that we're addressing folks that are already a little bit used to providing that kind of feedback in that way. But I really do agree that splitting those off from might be reasonable. And then I like David's suggestion about maybe combining the other 4 buckets more by field than by role.
And on the stakeholder engagement, is the goal to get folks input on, I think we have this somewhere, but like get folks input on strategies and things like that? Or is it more to kind of get an inventory of what's being used the most, what is out there? Because that also, I think, affects the kind of conversation that we're structuring. Like, is it about how do you use data? What data do you lean on? Or is it more like, what do you think we need to do as a work group to focus on and things like that?
Well, I mean, I guess it's really up to us to make that call. I was sort of thinking, oh, look, thank you, Megan. I was sort of thinking that it was kind of a combo of what you've just said, that it's both, how do they currently use data? What is the data that they use? Where do they go for information? And then also, what would they like to be able to do? What questions would they, I mean, it's partially what are you doing now? And then how would you use this if we could make it better?
Is there also space of finding out what's missing?
Like specific data points, do you mean?
Yeah, or if we only knew X, this we would be able to serve families in this way, or
Yeah, I
that.
don't see why we couldn't ask questions like that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, like, it's so hard because there's so many things we could spend time on, but it's like, there's the
That's
question.
the focus problem.
I know.
Right.
I'm just gonna keep throwing things at the wall for you to think about.
I know, our job, David, was to focus here.
You're right. You're right. Area of focus is the heading. One question. So, we're talking about how they're using and integrating data. But then, of course, there's also the question of people who are actually collecting data that maybe are not reporting that data, or that the state doesn't have access to it. And so it does seem useful to get like a sense of what data are you collecting, like how are you collecting it, to see those are things that we can scale, right? If there's some inventory of what's happening, but maybe that can fit in these buckets. And I'm not trying to overcomplicate things, but it would seem like part of our effort on stakeholder engagement is sort of a scan of like what's out there and what is being done already.
I sort of would like to propose that level of detail as maybe a next step, only because I don't want us to dive too deeply into like specific data points or data measures. I think the conversation we're having at this point is a little bit more conceptual. It doesn't mean that we can't include some specificity in these conversations. And certainly, like when you're asking folks, what do you want to know? We do want a little bit of clarity because that's part of how we're developing the why. But I think, we have a couple of parallel projects where we're doing more like data inventory kind of work, or really diving into, like, I think someone asked a question earlier, like, do we even have the data to measure some of these questions, or how would we get there? And I think some of that is a little bit of phase two. Not that it's not important to be thinking about that at this point, but given that we have to focus a little bit this initial set of conversations, I hope that what we're agreeing is that this isn't the last point in the wheel that we would be reaching out and gathering feedback, but it's just serving this first phase purpose. And I do think that a next phase purpose would really be to dive more deeply into exactly what is the data you are collecting, where are you putting it, how is that matching with other kinds of data? And I just want, that's my only hesitancy. But if you guys feel differently or feel like we'd really be missing something if we didn't ask that up front, then I'm open to that for sure.
Well, and I think it's also depending on how we engage the stakeholders. Is that something, I know we're all surveyed to death, but is that something we could potentially survey a follow-up question and just not spend time in our precious hour, whatever hour and a half that we have together with these folks, but we could potentially collect that. So I think there's that angle. I think the other angle is, especially with providers, or at least when I do a stakeholder meeting with providers, they very easily get into the weeds because that's where their lens is, and that's where the lanes are. So just a way to capture that, even if it's not something we need to use at the moment, but we're still collecting. So as that can help inform the next phase, so we're not losing that piece. Because we may ask a big broad question.
Is what you're asking for.
Well, we may ask a big broad question and they're going to laser in on this one particular thing, which is good, but it's also not the full, so we just need to be able to collect that so that way we can use it and then try to bring them back out to the larger picture.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've even settled on exactly what stakeholder engagement includes. I mean, you mentioned like an hour and a half conversation, but I don't even know if we're there. I mean, it might be surveys, it might be webinars, it might be in person. I don't know. I don't think we're there yet. So I agree that it wouldn't necessarily be a useful thing to like have each person talk about the data they collect on a call. Like that probably would not be the best way to do it. But anyway.
Well, I do think that we had agreed that we were going to split this kind of stakeholder engagement into 2 phases, that we were going to be asking this group to maybe facilitate a few of these kind of formal focus groupy listening session conversations in August and September, and that we were going to actually conduct a survey immediately following, like using some of that information, and then conduct a survey with that we, that we could determine. And so that, oh, look, see, and so that we would have sort of that 2-part for this initial phase, and then we would be coming back to that we would use those survey findings and that those conversations to kind of draft our recommendations for this roadmap to present back out to the Early Learning Council in January. Allison, were you going to say something?
Really, I was just going to second what you were saying about trying to initially here keep our focus on, what we have and that we can do something with.
Yeah.
More short term. And I do think every meeting we have, we probably need a parking lot for these ideas and thoughts that come up so that we do capture them, even if we're not going to do something with them right away.
So it doesn't seem like we are quite ready to pluck out any of our policy questions, but that we may, so just if I'm reading the room, and again, please tell me if this is not what, if you don't think we're quite there yet, but it seems as though we're not quite ready to pluck any one policy question out of our list, but that we may be able to better narrow those areas of focus that Megan, that you had on the slide, like one before this, to really say like that we may be able to just ask a more general question about how stakeholders are currently using and integrating data. What is the data that they sort of lean on in their work and decision-making processes, and that sort of what would they, if we could answer these questions, how would they use them? So that we're sort of asking more concrete questions about the policy, about our recommended policy questions, but that it doesn't seem like we're quite ready to pick one out of the, or 2 out of the bunch.
And I would add to that, like, I think, and somebody else has already said this, but like, if you were to break the stakeholder groups up a bit, so parents kind of have their own group, I think you would want to just select some relevant questions around sort of program services. And, I don't think you'd want to throw all those policy questions at a parent group. I don't know that they'd find all of them like meaningful to them. But I do think, and I agree, I think the service, the people who actually are delivering the services, they could have the providers, they could have their own group. And I think in that group also, you might be able to have a reduced set of the policy questions that you have them focus on. So parents would have their own sort of set of questions, and so would the providers. And then the other groups, I really liked David's recommendation to think about more discipline or field-based separation, just so it's not.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
I think if we do that, which I like that idea too, I think we will be able to find commonalities and maybe different data points, but at the same time we'll be like, oh, all of these different 3 areas really have this same need and want. So I think it just builds, hopefully we'll build consensus without them hearing from each other. Would be a good thing.
Yeah.
I think we should keep reflecting on the best way to organize like the focus groups in particular, because you could get to a place where we decide, you know what, we need to have a focus group specifically on one of these policy questions. Like we need to have a workforce focus group, and then we need to have a return on investment focus group. I don't know. Like I just don't know what the correct answer is. And I think some of it's going to be determined by who is sort of signed up. But
yeah. And we don't only have one shot. So we could do one way and see what happens, and then use surveys to fill in the gaps of what we didn't get when we had that first conversation. If we feel like we need to come back around and have a second set of more targeted conversations, we absolutely can. So this is a low risk set of conversations, and I just don't want us to feel like there's one right way to do it, and if we don't get it right, we've missed our chance. Okay. Let's think. I just want to make so I'm a little behind the scenes question, Megan. Do we need to go back and review that slide that we skipped through, or can we move to talk about the one-page roadmap summary, which I think might answer the question that just came up in the chat?
Yeah, I think it's fine to move.
Okay.
And cover the other.
Okay.
Previously.
Okay, so so for members of this group, you should have received sort of a draft roadmap summary document, which is really kind of an overview about what the heck we're doing here. So I was just going to see if I could pull it up myself really quickly. There we go. And I guess it would be hard to share I can pull it up and share my screen. But essentially the audience for this document is both folks who are like, what the heck are you doing? But also potentially to share with the stakeholders that we might reach out to ask them questions, just to give them a sense about what is the process that they're contributing to and why are we asking them a bunch of these questions. So essentially this document lays out sort of what the Texas Early Learning Council is, that this roadmap work group is a sort of sub work group of that council. And our task is to explore a possible early childhood integrated data system. So we keep using the acronym ECIDS for that. It's really about sort of defining what an ECIDS is. So it's sort of acknowledging that early childhood services often span a lot of state agencies. That's certainly the case in Texas, and that there should be, that an ECIDS is really a way to help states either integrate or layer or combine data across programs so that we can better understand our early childhood system as a whole. As we talked about and shared in our last meeting, lots of states have tackled this in different ways. So there's, again, no one right way, but our task is really to come up with a roadmap. So what do we think, what do we think it could look like in Texas? What would be the reasons why we would want to pull data together in this way? We've talked a lot about sort of what is the use case? What are the questions we think we could answer? And then what would we maybe do with that information to help lay some groundwork for why that would be needed? I think we anticipate that we would be able to include some background information, an overview of our current systems and the data that exists in each of those systems. We would include some of our recommended policy questions, and then include sort of some information from stakeholders about how they would use this, what policy questions they think are most important, how they think it would shift or change the way that they approached systems work or made decisions or investments about serving our young kids and their families. And then it's really the long-term goal would be to decide whether or not as a group of both, does the Early Learning Council want to make a recommendation to move forward with sort of an implementation plan or an implementation strategy for this kind of integrated early data? And is there a way to be more concrete about the specific things that we would be asking for any given state agency in order to be able to make that happen? So that's sort of what this document is and says, probably like more succinctly than I just said it, and is a tool that we are hoping that folks can use internally to their organization and with their leadership if folks are trying to explain up their own chains what they're doing here every month, and then also as a way of explaining to stakeholders where we are in the process and how their feedback is going to be used. Megan or Chelsea, do either of you want to, or Allison, do either of you guys want to add to that, or did I miss something? And then does anybody have any questions?
I think you described it very well.
Great. So this is not a final document, I think. So now you guys have seen it in your emails. And so if you look through it and you have any changes or you know, something occurs to you in the shower, it's not too late. But I do think we'll be in a place where we're going to start to sort of finalize and use this document as a communication tool. Great. Okay. I think we've come to public comment. Is that where we are? And I think we do have a couple of folks that have registered to provide public comment.
We do. Do you?
So Megan, can I just?
We have plenty of time. So do you want to go back to that slide that we skipped, or do you want to?
Oh,
I was
yeah,
just going to ask
Okay.
if we were going to go back over that slide. So
good idea. Let's do that since we have time. So this, and Megan or Chelsea, would one of you guys be willing to walk us through this one? Or do you want me to? I'll do it. Okay.
Chelsea can do it. Or
Okay, great.
I'm happy to.
Sure. So basically, this is a kind of visualization putting together the existing programs and data systems that might go into an early childhood integrated data system if we decide to pursue one. And you'll see the color codes on the right-hand side. So we kind of differentiated whether the data system had at least some overlapping infrastructure, and those are in the light blue. And then the other early childhood data systems are in the dark blue. And then some other programs that aren't directly necessarily tied to early childhood data systems are in that gray box. But it's really just meant to provide a visualization of the data systems that might be involved.
So it's a lot of information on one slide, but I really do think it gives us sort of a pretty clear picture about how the Health and Human Service agencies, like where the data formally exists in each of those systems, at least at the state level, and sort of where there's already some work happening to connect that data, and then what might be next, or where we still have work to do. And this is also, I think, in part trying to answer that question about what data already exists. And do we even have the data points to measure the policy questions that we're asking? And so this is part of the way that we're trying to answer that.
I think this visual is extremely helpful for those of us that live and breathe these systems, you know, daily. But I think it's also extremely helpful when we're when you're talking to providers and or parents who may only know a sliver and how they can see that whole system working together. If we want them to react to something, this would be a good visual for them to kind of wrap their mind around. what the current system looks like?
I think it's just really helpful to me to see how many different data systems we're already trying to juggle and work with, and why it might be hard without some kind of integrated data system to understand like a big picture view of how we're doing when all these data systems exist to capture that data, and we don't yet have a smooth or formal way to connect that data across all these different data systems.
Well, I think too, as we think about potentially building an ESIDS, like, okay, where are those relationships already? You know, who are the light blues? They talk to each other already, but then like the groups that are in the white box, like how do we incorporate those data into the system too? So that's where, no wonder it makes my head hurt. Hey, David, can you just make this happen in your dashboard?
Yeah, I think that'll be good.
Okay.
But Megan, to Kim's point, this may be an overview that we would like to include alongside that roadmap summary document. Like they might need to go hand in hand in order to really explain what the heck we're doing.
Definitely agree.
Great. Well, thank you, Chelsea, for making that happen, because it really does help turn something very complicated into at least something that feels like we could get our arms around in one slide. So that's no easy feat. Okay, so now we're going to go to our public comment section, and I will, I think, just turn it over to Megan to help facilitate us through that.
Yeah. So we did have 2 folks register for public comment. Thank you both for doing that. I will promote you to a panelist so that you'll be able to talk. It'll just take a second to click in. But I wanted to give everyone listening in the overview here on public comment in general. So earlylearningtexas.org is the same place that you signed up for this meeting. And it has a section called meetings. Of course, it houses all the previous meeting information as well as the agenda once it's released, a minimum of 1 week prior to the meeting date. And that's where the instructions for submitting public comment are. But basically, you just have to email me and we'll get you on the docket. So for the commenters, please do state your name, your organization, if you're affiliated with one, and the agenda topic or topics that you're commenting on for the record. You will have 3 minutes to talk. You'll hear a chime sound at the 2-minute mark, which indicates you have 1 minute left. And y'all can ask work group members, feel free to ask questions after each speaker concludes. So I have just promoted Kate Hoffman is our first commenter. Kate, you should be a panelist. Let us know if you're able to talk.
Yes, hi, thank you.
So go for it.
Awesome, thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to provide public comment on agenda items 4 and 5. My name is Kate Hoffman, and I'm here on behalf of Early Matters, a statewide collaborative of business, civic, education, nonprofit, and philanthropic leaders dedicated to strategic investments in policies and practices that support our youngest learners. Representing more than 40% of the young children in Texas, Early Matters set out to develop a set of standardized indicators that would allow us to track our progress of our programmatic work and highlight areas for further advocacy. However, after spending months attempting to do this, we decided that the data collected across our state's fragmented systems left us with way too many assumptions. We were unable to answer the basic questions necessary to evaluate the status of our coalition's goals related to quality and sustainability of the childcare industry, high quality pre-K through 3rd education, kindergarten readiness, and high quality early educators. How many children are accessing childcare? Of those children who access childcare in public pre-K, which ones are receiving quality? Does what we define as quality lead to increased academic growth and outcomes? What is the quantity, quality, and pipeline of our ECE workforce? In light of this, we are highly supportive of the work that you all are doing and the resources that the Early Learning Council is investing in creating an ESIDS and in this work group. It is essential for the state to provide an integrated and aligned approach that would enable Texas to make informed decisions. Our coalition's experience provides a use case for just that. Today, I'd like to draw your attention quickly to 3 considerations. As a multi-region advocacy coalition, we affirm the suggestion that was given at the last meeting to have a policy question centered around understanding local data. Texas is unique in both its scale and its diversity, and ESIDS offers a great opportunity to identify across region bright spots, gaps, and services that correlate to outcomes in order to inform coordination, resource allocation, and program continuous improvement. Second, with the state's early learning strategic plan and tri-agency goals set for 2025, time is of the essence. Each year we wait to fix the problem is another year we remain in the dark about the state's support of millions of young children and outcomes of billions of taxpayer dollars. We therefore urge this group not only to focus on stakeholder input for an ESIDS many years down the road, but to push the broader Early Learning Council to take some key action now to provide better data transparency and efficiency. We recommend doing this by conducting a data inventory to generate a list of fields of the data currently collected and how it is collected from the agencies. This could be done through the stakeholder feedback process that you all are currently planning right now. Second, implementing a single common application across all learning programs, including regulated childcare, pre-K, and Head Start, and automatically assigning a PEIMS number to children who are served by any early learning program. Finally, Early Matters has formed a statewide early childhood data working group ourselves with more detailed data infrastructure recommendations, such as streamlined workforce databases with unique IDs for educators and standardized state cut scores for approved kindergarten entry assessments in all domains. We are eager to engage in the stakeholder feedback process and to have a more detailed working session with you all to outline the current input, output, and outcomes measures, the current gaps in what we are measuring, and all of our proposed collection solutions to get there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Kate?
So Kate, based on your examination of an attempt to kind of get the measures to drive your work, do you think the policy questions we have now can capture the policy questions that you were unable to answer, or do you think there's anything missing that we should highlight?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that we want to highlight is exactly what you brought up, David, at the last meeting around local data and really being able to compare across regions. That would be helpful for us as we are trying to compare across our local coalitions. So that's one thing that I think is missing is where is this going well, where is it not, and how can we learn from each other or allocate resources differently. And then I think part of kind of what else we're looking at is really that pre-K through 3rd grade piece of it, which I don't think is as included in your policy questions. So I would push for that to be included as well, since TEA does not currently have a lot of data on what is happening before 3rd grade either. And this is an opportunity to push on that. And I think the rest of it is definitely encompassed in your policy questions, but what we're really interested in is providing some additional feedback on kind of what measures you all would specifically recommend to answer those questions, because I think you could answer them in a variety of ways. And that once you kind of narrow down there's a lot more to uncover. So I would say we would want to definitely provide input on how the indicators and measures for those specific questions.
Can I ask a question? This is Kirsten for Kate or for Megan. Could we get a copy of this written testimony? I think it'd be really helpful to look at all those points you made. You made some really good ones. Thank you, Kate.
No problem. I'm happy to send it to Megan. I wasn't able to send it in yesterday before the 5 p.m. written deadline, but happy to do so now if it's possible for it to be distributed.
Yeah, just send it over to Chelsea actually, and she'll distribute it out to the work group.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate your feedback. And we still have one more, Megan? Okay.
We do. Thanks so much, Kate. Next up will be Reagan Horchow. So give me just 1 second. All right. Reagan, once you're able to unmute yourself, you're welcome to go ahead and start. Reagan, can you hear us?
I can hear y'all. Can you
Oh,
hear
great.
me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, I've had a fruit basket turn up of, Reagan Horchow. I am, while I'm engaged in many different efforts that you all know about, I am speaking today just for myself and on items, I believe it's 4 and 5, but basically the whole process. And I was working under the assumption that we all agree that we need an integrated data system. So I'm a little surprised that that seems to be still in question. So my comments are assuming that we all agree that we need some form of integrated data system. And so to the efforts that you all are planning in terms of stakeholder engagement, I'm wondering if you couldn't, I think you all are on the right path. Your 3 questions in that last slide that you want to ask people, I think are the key questions. I don't know why all of the stakeholders need to really engage on all of your policy questions. I think your policy questions are on the right path, but I would just advocate and encourage you in an effort to move this as fast as we can, to use the time when you're engaging with stakeholders to ask those key questions, but I would just suggest that they be asked slightly more specifically. So Kate suggested, what are the fields your system, if you're talking to a stakeholder that's involved with the system, what are the fields that you're currently collecting? How are you asking the questions so that we can compare and connect and make sure our agencies are all using the same kinds of language? And then secondarily, what questions are you currently answering? What are the data, what are the reports that you're currently generating? And then most importantly for going forward, what's missing from those? What are the questions you need to get answered that an integrated data system might help you with? So what are the questions that you want answered? And I'm imagining they would overlap with your policy questions, but I would want to know from each stakeholder, what are the things that you need to know that you're not able to answer right now based upon the data that you have access to? And then what would an integrated system improve in terms of your work? So not just what questions could you get answered, but how would things be improved for our children if we could use our data better? And so I am so appreciative of this process and all of your time and efforts. And I know, because I have developed software and programs and systems like this before, that the work that you all are doing is actually the most critical. So if we can be clear about what we need an integrated system to do for us, actually creating the system is not that hard. So if you all will, I'm encouraging you as you are struggling with what this stakeholder engagement process might be, I would encourage you to be very narrow and just ask those 3 questions and ask them very specifically. Because if you could in your process get some of the specifics back, like the list of the fields and the list of the reports that are currently being generated by all of the stakeholders, then some of the background work on actually creating an integrated database could start happening faster than if it weren't. So thank you again to all of you for your time and effort on this. And I'm just hoping we can move this along at a faster pace.
Great. Thank you very much for your feedback. That makes sense. Is there anyone have any questions for Reagan?
I was just going to say, I really like the suggestion of asking stakeholders how they would use data and how it would impact their work. I think that that's a good centering question for us to think about.
I agree. And I also liked this idea of how would knowing this improve your work, because I really do think it helps us with that use case scenario, right? Instead of just here are the things that we would want to know, if we can explain why it would be of benefit to the kids and families specifically, I think that really helps us, helps with our use case, sort of helps with the behind the scenes of it. So I really liked that suggestion also.
And we do have a question on the areas of focus around how they'll use the new information.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we center it sort of in the way Reagan's recommending, that makes sense. I think the question that Reagan raised, and I think Kate raised, and I raised a little bit earlier, is sort of trying to understand what's currently being collected. And I just think that's still a remaining question for us to answer is, you know, how do we get at that information? Because I think that'll also be useful in identifying gaps, seeing what's currently being collected, maybe not reported, all the different things that we might learn from that. I think we should consider building in, at least in the survey process, if we can.
May I ask one more question? Am I allowed? Megan, am I allowed to ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So another thing I think would be important to learn from, or this is a comment, not a question. The other thing I think would be helpful to learn from your stakeholders is if we are able to have an integrated system, where does it live and who owns it? Because by definition, a single system has to have a single owner. And I would be interested to know from the stakeholders where they see that sitting. Is it at the governor's office? Is it, you know, Megan? Is it who is it that's going to own this system? And I imagine we'll get lots of different ideas about that.
That is a very important question.
I think it's the billion dollar question.
I was just going to add, when we can collect that information on the fields, it's also will tell us where the duplicative information lies. How many times do we ask a family to prove their income? How many times do we ask a family? And where can we streamline to make us all more efficient? So.
Okay, I think that was, Megan, those were our two. Okay, so given that it is 2:29, I am going to note that the next Texas Early Learning Council meeting is July 15th, and that our work group is scheduled to provide an update and present sort of what we've been talking about and what our plan is for moving forward, including our proposal for these stakeholder surveys and engagement touch points over the coming months. I feel like given that that's a month from now and this group has been meeting monthly, I don't know that we need another meeting between now and then, but I think our recommendation is for this group to continue to meet monthly after that as we move towards our January deliverable. And so I just had general set of thumbs up, thumbs down. Does that, so we would, the next meeting of this work group would then be in August. Is that right, Megan? Or would we also meet separately in July?
I think maybe late July, late July, early August, after the TLC meeting on July 15th, based on how calendars shake out.
Okay, so we'll work on calendaring that out, and you should expect to hear from Chelsea for us to sort out those dates. And then Allison will be our spokesperson at the TELC meeting on July 15th to help present sort of what we've been talking about and where we are so far. Okay, I think there will be minutes coming after this, and I think this has been a really productive time together, and I really appreciate, as always, y'all joining us on a Friday afternoon. And I think we're gonna officially adjourn.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Chelsea.
Have a good weekend, y'all. Bye.
Thanks.